I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week, policing meets politics. How our new federal lawsuit over police protest tactics, recent Midtown shootings, and City Hall's migration-driven budget trade-offs shaping this year's hotly contested mayoral race. But first, the Trump administration deployed 800 National Guard troops this week to Washington, invoked emergency powers to temporarily direct the Metropolitan Police Department. It's a move the White House calls federalization. D.C. officials call a takeover. About 120 FBI agents also shifting to night patrols. Our guest, Devlin Barrett of the New York Times, he's reporting on the D.C. federalization, how those moves could shape public trust and personal safety, and he's reporting to us from the Justice Department in Washington. Devlin, 800 National Guard troops, Secret Service, DEA, FBI. Do you feel any safer in Washington?
Well, look, D.C. does have a crime problem, like a lot of American cities. I think a lot of D.C. residents would argue with the notion that there was some impending crisis or, the kind of problem that required, soldiers with weapons on the streets. I don't see any noticeable difference in safety, certainly in the downtown part of the city. I walk through most of downtown every day. It's really no different, both in terms of people on the street and frankly, in terms of the amount of law enforcement on the street, which was significant before all this.
It's interesting that, to me, that the mayor has voiced some reservations, but the police chief says, in effect, why not? Who's right here?
Well, the thing to understand about how the city is reacting is they have 2 points to make, which seem on the surface to be in contradiction with each other, but they really aren't. The first point the mayor has made is this is not an appropriate use of federal resources. This is not something the city asked for. This is not something the city does not feel like troops are necessary, for example, to fix the crime problems that do exist in the city. However, the one thing to keep in mind about the politics of crime, as opposed to the dry data of crime, is that there is no pro-crime constituency. There's, a police chief is never going to say, ultimately, I don't want more resources. I don't want more help. There's nothing we could do with those people. So the police chief is saying, great, these people can help us get illegal guns off the streets. These people can help us, make sure that some of our public spaces are safer at night when the city does have a problem, frankly, with carjackings, car thefts, and, groups of teenagers causing trouble and in some cases just breaking the law. Like, those are real things that exist here. I think the city would say, city officials have said, this was unnecessary. This is sort of unfair to the residents of DC. But that doesn't mean there aren't things that these people can do to make the city better.
And what do the residents of D.C. think about it? Are they happy, or are they out of the politics and they say, we want to be safer, we don't care who's patrolling the streets?
The thing about DC politics is there's often a sort of resentful relationship between the people who live in the city and the federal government that, runs large chunks of the city.
Without representation, for the most part.
Without representation. And, there's been a long time fight by some parts of the city population and political leaders to get statehood for the city. To the people who believe in that and who have fought for that, this is a step backward away from statehood. So that is frustrating. It is frustrating to them in that sense. It's also, look, I don't think many Americans pine for streets full of soldiers. But to be clear, DC doesn't really have streets full of soldiers yet. The thing to keep in mind about the 800 National Guard and the 500 or so law enforcement agents is, if this were a restaurant, you would call it a slow open. This is happening very gradually. Even a president can't snap their fingers and put 1,300 people in uniforms on the street overnight. So last night, you saw, for example, some military, some National Guard troops on the National Mall. That's a handful of people. That's about the extent of what is visible in terms of the National Guard right now. There will be more of that. There will be more visible presence. But it's not like Humvees just rolled into town Tuesday morning and set up shop in the street corners. That's not what's happening.
Devlin, it's hard to look at metrics objectively, But the president of the White House say per capita crime is very high in Washington compared to other cities. Washington officials say, yeah, we've got a crime problem, of course, but lots of other cities are much, much worse. And in fact, the trajectory has been going down. Who's right? Or doesn't
Well,
it matter?
I think the city's description is much more accurate than the White House's description of the state of crime in Washington, D.C. But the city's description is that there is a crime problem. The city was creating nighttime curfews for teenagers in some parts of the city before this declaration by the president. The president describes a sort of Mad Max, Snake Plissken, lawless nightmare scenario of Washington, D.C. That's not what's happening. There is, however, a crime problem, and there are things that could be better, certainly better. And it is also true that there was sort of a post-pandemic increase in crime, a pandemic and post-pandemic increase in crime, like a lot of cities in America, and that has been coming down for about 2 years. So it is getting better. But one, data is not super comforting to a lot of people when it comes to crime
No,
stats.
not if you're a crime victim, for sure.
Absolutely not. Or someone you know is a crime victim. That's very important. And that's another part of how Trump gets to make this decision. The other thing I would just point out is that when people talk about crime, just think about the politics of crime for a minute as opposed to the data. When people talk about crime, they often talk about things that aren't technically or necessarily crimes, such as homelessness, aggressive panhandling, drug addiction evidence of drug addiction on the streets. Those are things that make people feel unsafe, but those aren't necessarily things that the police will say, this is our problem to fix. So when you talk about crime, I think it's important to understand the political context and how people really experience that sense of fear or that sense of safety, as opposed to just, well, the percentage is 10.7 or whatever. And I think all these things are part of the same conversation.
The president, as we know, takes a lot of things personally. How personal is his reaction because one of the recent crime victims was a protege of Elon Musk on Doge?
It's Sam, that's exactly right. And that's what we were just talking about, right? Like the statistics are one thing, but when you know someone who's been the victim of a crime, most people have a very visceral, strong reaction to that. And that is what has happened with the president. So a young former Doge staffer was basically assaulted by a group of teenagers, 14 and 15-year-olds basically, very late the other night in the city. And there was a picture of him, with a broken nose and a very bloody torso. That's shocking and is understandably shocking. And the president was shocked by it and upset by it. And that is part of why we are here right now. Part of the reason why this is happening is because one specific person who the president cares about was attacked on the street in a crime. And I think that's important to understand because in some way that's sort of a microcosm of the entire politics of crime, right? You can talk about the data all day, but if you know someone or if you yourself were the victim of a crime, you often think very differently about crime than what the data maybe says you should think.
It's something that Stalin said, didn't he? That 100,000 victims are a statistic, one victim is a tragedy. I guess that's what it comes down to in this case, too. Devlin, what powers do these extra law enforcement people have, and do they actually have any experience at enforcing the law? What does an FBI agent do on night patrol in the district?
Well, that's an important thing to understand about this rollout, this ramp up, this federal takeover, depending on how you want to talk about it. So the National Guard troops, let's break down each group of people that are going to be out there. Those troops do not have the power to arrest anyone. They are there as sort of a visible show of force. They are there to sort of make people feel safer. And they may well accomplish that. That is sort of a visible presence. And you saw that on the mall on Tuesday night. That's what those soldiers were doing there, to make people feel more safe. Now, if they're not arresting people, how much does it matter? Fair enough. But again, a lot of the discussion of crime is about how people feel. Mm-hmm. The federal agents, it's important to remember that a lot of the federal agents that are being pushed into the street at night right now are not people with patrol experience, are not people with patrol training. Some of them are, but that would be almost accidental to what they do at the FBI, for example, where agents are investigators. There's no, sort of pool of FBI patrol agents. That's not a thing the FBI does. They're investigators. A lot of them are accountants, for example. Um, so there is a concern for a lot of the people who are in the FBI or some of these other agencies that they're basically being misused this way. And there's some risks to just putting a bunch of people on the street who don't have the training and experience to do street patrol work. But what the city is saying is that they're going to try as best they can to pair up the city police with the federal agents. So you have strength in numbers, and you also have, some sort of mutual protection and collaboration that does not mean you just have guys wandering around who don't really know how the streets work.
Devlin, is there a political liability potentially for the president? Doesn't this become his problem at some point since he's being so proactive? And how will he determine what success is?
I mean, we're asking that exact question because I would argue it's very unclear right now how they're going to define success. I will just point out that, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, who's sort of tasked with overseeing this effort, declared on Monday that the goal is to end crime in DC. I've never lived in a city that ended crime. I don't think that's really a measurable or achievable end.
Or a society in which crime was ended.
Correct. Maybe someday, who knows? But, they are setting a very high bar for themselves, and the law gives them 30 days to operate this way. So it's very unclear to me how they're going to say, this is clearly a success based on our own terms. I do think there is a world in which if you put enough bodies on the street, if you put enough uniforms on the street, you will get a week-to-week reduction in street crime, such as carjackings or youth crime. Like, that is possible. I don't rule that out by any means, because one of the things I remember from covering the NYPD years ago is they would sometimes flood an area with bodies and patrol officers, and you would see significant decreases as long as those bodies and patrol officers were in abundance in that area. Like, that is a strategy that can work. We don't know yet if it's going to work here.
Devlin Barrett, thank you for joining us from the Justice Department in Washington. And coming up next, how policing protests migration colliding with the mayoral race in New York City. As the mayoral race accelerates, a new federal lawsuit challenges the NYPD protest tactics. Fallout from the Midtown mass shooting that killed a off-duty officer continues, and City Hall's migration response is reshaping budgets and priorities. Joining us now, Dana Rubenstein of the New York Times on city politics and government, and Maria Kramer of the New York Times on the NYPD and crime. Dana, we were talking with Devlin Barrett about crime in Washington, the president's response to that. How is crime playing out in the mayoral campaign here?
Well, it's interesting. The mayor, Eric Adams, is able to point to decreases in murders and shootings, as Maria can attest better than I can. And those drops seem to be credible and in keeping with national trends. So he's saying that, he's doing what he promised to do, and the city is, in fact, safer. Cuomo is arguing that, the city could be safer yet. And Mamdani is sort of making the point that, police officers are encumbered with too many non-policing responsibilities. So he's arguing that he would create a separate department staffed with social workers and people like that who would sort of tend to the less law enforcement related things that police do, like dealing with mentally ill homeless people.
Maria, that goes a little bit to a story you had recently on the quality of life teams that are being deployed around the city to do things that are not necessarily criminal per se. Why do people object to that?
Well, technically they are criminal. They're just much more minor offenses. I'm thinking about panhandling, illegal scooter bikes, abandoned vehicles. These, what we would call what the mayor and Commissioner Jessica Tisch are calling quality of life issues that make certain neighborhoods feel like their neighborhoods are chaotic, dysfunctional,
Under siege.
under siege by these sort of low-level offenses that creep up and make you feel like you are not living in a place with order. And so these quality of life teams have been basically put in every precinct in nearly every borough except for Staten Island, and that borough is getting its quality of life teams next week. To address these issues. The objections are coming from groups like Legal Aid, which they defend indigent clients, indigent defendants, and the NYCLU, because they are worried that these kinds of teams are going to focus too hard on minorities, they're going to focus too hard on low-level offenses that keep people detained and over-police, essentially.
But is it the purpose to focus on low-level offenses, who, regardless of who they catch in the act?
Well, yes, that is the purpose, but the city's also still has the city has a very long memory. And
yes.
One of the things that they remember very well are the broken windows theory of policing that, basically finds that if you take care of low-level crimes, you therefore prevent major crimes from happening. Jessica Tisch has been very clear, pushing back on that, saying this is not about preventing crime. This is about taking care of the problem that is in front of us right now by having residents call 311. That's the city's non-emergency hotline for loud music, problems like that, and this is not about preventing crime at all. But again, if you talk to Legal Aid, if you talk to the NYCLU, if you speak to some people on the streets too, they'll say we want more information, we want more data. We're concerned about how these teams are going to go out and how they're going to interact with people in the community, and I think more transparency is what they would say would help engender more trust.
Does this become a veiled sort of substitute for stop and frisk?
Well, that's what the concern is on groups like Legal Aid and NYCLU. And of course, the police would push back and say, no, that's not what this is about. This is not about trying to target anybody or control one neighborhood over another more. This is about stopping incidents that are arising in time. We're getting 311 calls about loud noises. People, this might seem like a small thing, but if you are living in
Not if you can't sleep.
If you can't sleep, you got to go to work the next day. It's not a small thing, and people are used to calling 311 about a loud neighbor and waiting hours, if not days, for any kind of a response. They would say this is a way of getting ahead of that and being faster about responding.
Dana, is the migrant crisis over in New York City, or do we have a new migrant crisis, people being held in federal detention? It's now a federal problem, not Mayor Adams' problem.
Yeah, the migrant crisis, as the term was used a couple years ago, appears to have largely abated. I think the number of migrants in city shelters is down to like 30,000, and at its height, it was more than 60,000. I might be getting those numbers wrong, but yeah, I mean, the whole thing has taken a different character now that immigrants are showing up for routine hearings at 26 Federal Plaza and in many cases getting detained.
Would we say that President Trump deserves the credit for curbing that crisis, certainly as far as New York City is concerned?
Well, he certainly has closed the borders, so that has stemmed the tide of migrants coming to New York City. I mean, to take a step back, there was always some dispute over whether it was even accurate to refer to it as a crisis. But I think you can certainly also credit him for what's happening at 26 Federal Plaza as well.
So we can give him some credit and also some blame for the consequences of it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, what's happening down there is, families are being separated. People are trying to abide by the law and show up for their hearings and are being dragged away by people in masks.
Why are they wearing masks? What is the point of that?
An interesting question. I mean, they say it's for their own safety.
Well, cops don't wear masks.
That's true. I think the activities that cops are engaged in are generally less controversial than what the ICE agents at 26 Federal Plaza are engaged in.
Maria, what about crime in New York City? We've seen lots of conflicting statistics in Washington. Crime is going down, crime is going up, crime per capita is higher than almost anywhere else. What is it in New York City? And of course, there's no acceptable level of crime. But how are we doing? How is this mayor doing in terms of crime and his new police commissioner as well?
I would say that the crime picture looks a lot like it does in other major cities. You had a huge surge in crime during the pandemic. New York was not immune to this, and certainly was not alone, because this was happening across the country. And what we've seen in the last couple of years, this has been a trend that's been falling since before Trump came into office, is crime is falling. You have shootings down, you have homicides down. You know, the mayor and Commissioner Tisch are using every opportunity and every news conference they are at to tout these numbers and talk about quote unquote record lows. So there are many ways of looking at these numbers. You have what's called the 7 major crimes. Those are the murders, those are rapes, those are felony assaults. Those are the crimes that are really scary. Those are the big major crimes, and those are falling, and they've been falling for quite some time now. But people still feel like assaults are too frequent. Felony assaults, which is one of the major crimes, remains a stubborn number to get down. So there are so many ways to look at these statistics and to take credit for them, but there's so many factors also that go into crime numbers. So it's very difficult to pinpoint anything to one particular source.
The president dispatching law enforcement, National Guard troops to Washington. Whatever happened to the additional law enforcement people the governor, other people were sending into the subway? Did that work? Did that have any effect?
Well, yes. I mean, do we say that it was the National Guard that got those numbers down? I don't know that you can ascribe it to that. I'd have to do more research and get back to you, I suppose. But we did have an increase.
It is a pleasure to have someone answer a question by saying, "I don't know."
I really don't know, and because it's you had I think it was 1,000 National Guardsmen out there, but you also had a lot of police on the subway cars, and that was something that they began doing more recently, putting police officers on the cars themselves, not just on the platforms or at the stations, looking for people who are trying to jump the turnstile. The concern was the crime is happening in the subway cars, and so we need to have people on the ground there to do that. And yeah, the numbers show a decrease. It's true. At the same time, how long can you keep this up? How long can you keep officers stationed in one place? I mean, the commissioner talks about hot zones and moving a law enforcement presence to where it needs to be, and she talks about a more surgical way of looking at crime. And by all accounts, the numbers would show that that's successful. But we also have to wonder, what is the long-term impact? How do you keep this down? And that is a question, I'm sorry, that many would say you can't just answer with police presence. You have to look at things in a more holistic way.
Which is what Mamdani talks
Yes, that would go into where Mamdani has been, Assemblyman Mamdani has been trying to push this idea that you need to look at social services, you need to have people who know what they're doing when it comes to those who are in a mental health crisis, and address the problem of homelessness.
Dana, we talked a lot, or at least people who thought they knew what was going on, talked a lot about the Democratic primary for mayor being Andrew Cuomo's to lose. He did. What about now? Is the mayoral election in November Mamdani's to lose?
Yes, New York is a city where Democrats outnumber Republicans 6-1, and where people generally who are Democratic vote for the Democratic candidate, who is in this case Mamdani. Cuomo's running on an independent line, as is Adams and Jim Walden, and you've got Curtis Sliwa, and those guys are all sort of poised to split the anti-Mamdani vote at this point. So yeah, Mamdani, if there are no major screw-ups or scandals or catastrophes, he's likely to win the November election.
The President, Trump, seems to be of two minds about the mayoral race. One is if Mamdani wins, he's got a wonderful progressive socialist foil for the Republicans to run against in the midterms and beyond. The other one is he's got a lot of real estate people, friends in New York, who are sort of imploring him to get Adams out of the race or do something else so that the stronger opponent to Mamdani can defeat him. What is the president likely to do, and what can he do technically, legally, politically, to get Adams out of the race if he wants to? He seems, the only alternatives are to get him indicted again or offer him a job he can't refuse.
Right, and to be clear, Adams's name will remain on the ballot either way, right? Even if he is not
Correct.
actively campaigning. Yeah, I think, it's a tricky situation for Trump because obviously his name is relatively toxic in New York City, and any impression that voters have that he is acting on behalf of one candidate or another is not good for that candidate from a political standpoint. I mean, we saw that last week when my colleague Nick reported that, Cuomo had a phone call with Trump in recent weeks, and that sort of spawned this whole news cycle about whether or not Cuomo and Trump were sort of working together to strategize against Mamdani. So yeah, I think Trump's options are relatively limited. There's also an interesting argument that I heard yesterday that by having Mamdani as mayor, it would actually heighten the electoral prospects of Elise Stefanik for governor. And Elise is obviously a super close Trump ally, and he wants her to win the gubernatorial election next year. So to have Mamdani as a foil for her would theoretically be beneficial. But honestly, who knows?
Sounds a little desperate for Andrew Cuomo to accuse Mamdani of nepotism, considering he is, of course, a Cuomo. I remember at one point he was accused of using his influence or the fact that he was the governor's son of getting lots of law clients. And the governor, Mario Cuomo, called me and said, "How dare you accuse Andrew of that?" Andrew is as honest as the day is long. He told me that on December 21st, which happened to be the shortest day of the year. Dana and Maria, thank you so much for joining us. And that's it for this edition of Close Up. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts. And don't forget to download the CUNY TV app. You can catch our weekly program on the go, anytime, anywhere.